Welcome, everybody, to the Tools for the Modern Man podcast. I'm Pete Beskis, your host, and today I'm really excited to have my very first guest, Dr. Nick Sotelo. Nick and I met in the Dad's Edge Alliance Mastermind Men's Group, and he is an amazing resource, one of the top guys in the group, and I thought it would be a real treat to have him on this podcast to share his insights and information with all of you. Welcome, Nick, to the podcast.
Yeah, thanks, Pete. Thanks for having me.
I appreciate you being here. So let's dive in first. Tell my audience who you are and what you do.
Sure. It's always a tough question, particularly for me to answer because I have done lots of things and I do lots of things. But today, the way I'll respond to that is I am a professor, therapist, and coach. So those are kind of the three professional irons in the fire, so to speak. I'm also a husband and father. And I think with those five things, that encapsulates pretty much everything I do in my life, day in and day out.
That's awesome. And now I know you have a pretty diverse background. Can you tell us a little bit about, your history, where you kind of came up from and
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been in the helping profession for over 22 years now, pushing 23. And so that was my field and career straight out of undergraduate school and even prior to that, and just been um, part of groups and organizations that are all about helping people be better people. And for me, that really started off in the late 90s when I joined the field of youth corrections. And that's where my professional career started. And just about a year ago, here in a couple of days, actually, a year ago, I closed that. It's more than a chapter. I closed that novel in my life, sort of. I'm actually going back to do some training here on a contract basis. But for the most part, I moved on from that part of my life and really am looking forward to the new novel or chapter in my life, which is full-time academia as a professor and expanding what I do in the coaching world. And as a coach, I help men that struggle with destructive anger. Obviously, in youth corrections, I've seen a ton of cases where anger is, at the root of a lot of the problems, and seen kind of how different approaches work or don't work when it comes to deep-seated anger issues. And that's something that I want to bring to the world on a bigger scale because I have professional experience and personal experience with anger and how to overcome destructive anger.
oh, that's awesome. And I know that's such a necessary and needed avenue to explore and to work on, especially I think all of us men feel that to the core. Like anger is one of our go-to emotions, and I think it's, like you said, it's very destructive. But today we're going to talk a little about core values, and I know that you coached me up on some core values. I thought to myself that I was pretty well versed in it until you and I had a great conversation around it, and I really thought I'd want to bring that forward to this group because I always preach core values. I know in our men's mastermind we preach core values, but you approached it a little bit differently. So explain to us first do you see core values as being important?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm of the belief that we were anybody listening to this right now, you were put on this planet for a reason. Um, while you are there's 8 billion people on the planet, there is infinite number of possibilities and combinations. You are you, and nobody else can be you, and there will never be another you. And part of that, who you are, I think that's one of the most important questions you could ever ask, is core values. And to kind of operationalize or define core values, it's who you are and the things that you do no matter what the circumstance is, no matter what the opportunity is, no matter what the perceived outcome is. It's the consistent things that make you who you are. And why they're important to have complete clarity on is because if you're not clear on your core values, then by default you're living out someone else's or something else's core values. And that may or may not be a good or bad thing, but ultimately, if you aren't clear on your own core values, it's going to catch up to you. You're going to find yourself in a phase of life of wondering, why in the world am I doing this? How did I get here? And for me, when I peel back those layers, it's often a lack of clarity on who who you are, and then part of who you are is what are your core values.
Okay. So can you give us some examples of how that shows up if you're aligned with them or if you're not aligned with them?
Sure. So it's just building on kind of what I said. It can come up in just overall life satisfaction. It could come up in relationship or marital satisfaction. Comes up in career satisfaction, but it comes up in these times in our life when we, in a lot of different ways, we come to this frustration point or this friction point, or this, for some people it's a complete breakdown. They have a break, around this. My training is in mental health, right? So I can speak to that and have experience helping people through that. But it can be an absolute break, and this is the midlife crisis or the identity crisis. So what does it look like? I mean, it looks like feeling lost. Like, how did I get here? What am I doing? Why do I keep doing this day in and day out? And when you don't have good answers to those types of questions that you ask yourself, again, part of that is, in my experience, somebody who doesn't know who they are, and part of knowing who you are is understanding what your core values are. So how does it generally come up and rear its head? It's just a dissatisfaction with what it is that's going on in your life presently, and it's looking back and not being able to really tell, how in the world did I get here in the first place?
Yeah, and then this is actually, I just thought about another question to follow up on that. You've worked with youth, and I think this props up when you are young. We oftentimes identify with our parents' core values or our community's core values. Speaking to somebody who's younger, how can they start to identify it perhaps earlier as opposed to reaching that point of dissatisfaction or midlife crisis that I know I have personally felt, and I think many of the listeners have as well?
Yeah. I think it was Frederick Douglass that has the quote that I'm going to botch, but it's something about how it's easier to bring up, strong young men than it is to fix adult men, right? And
Yeah.
so I appreciate that question for sure. So again, age and stage wise, dipping into psychological theory from Erickson, it says that the teen years through young adults, so 15 to 25, I'll just grossly cut it there. It's all about identity formation, right? That's a huge part of what's going on for people. Who am I? Who do I belong with? Who do I associate with, and who do I not associate with, right? And then Erickson says that's the life struggle that everybody needs to wrestle with during that stage. And of course, I don't believe in any model 100% lockstep, especially when they're linear models. But this has really helped me kind of understand what is going on for people, what is going on for generations of people, and what's going on at a societal level, because I think there's some wisdom to that. So for young people, it's getting exposure, I think, is one of the big things. Exposing yourself to all types of experiences, all types of people, all types of activities, and finding out what makes sense to you. What do you enjoy? What do you not enjoy? What do you not enjoy, but all things indicate that you probably ought to be able to do to a certain degree in order to have some success, right? I mean,
Mhm.
if you don't like keeping a schedule, okay, but the vast majority of things that you're going to do and do intentionally are probably going to require you to keep some sort of a schedule, right? So there are going to be some things that you're like, yeah, that's not just for me, but all things are going to point to, well, you've got to be able to do that thing just enough in order to get by there. So and I think it's this is a tough one too, right? I think as young people, it's asking for help, right? It's finding people who are willing to uh, take the time to invest in you, to get to know you, it's the whole mentor movement, who are willing to create a meaningful relationship with you, and that are willing to be part of your life kind of for the long term, right?
Yeah.
Uh, and I think this is where we're going to circle to at some point in our conversation. This is why uh, going through a core values type exercise with somebody else is really where it's at in terms of getting the most out of the whole concept of core values. So for young people, it's getting exposure. For adults that are raising young people, you know have them do things or explore things that maybe you're not interested in. That's a huge part of it. When you asked me a second ago about how does somebody know when core values are off in their life, I went to a family friend of mine who they're generational farmers in the area that I live in. Their name is well recognized. They own farmland all throughout the Pacific Northwest and through Alaska. And that was kind of that's they're farmers, right? That's the values that are associated with that. Well, one of them decided he wanted to be an architect. He didn't want to farm.
They didn't want to follow the family business, right? I
Right.
think we've all felt that. I know I have in my family.
Yeah. Right. So that's another example of like, I get it. This is where I come from. These are my roots, but I kind of want to do this thing over here. And is the family willing to support that, willing to encourage that? Or do they double down on whatever the thing is, in this case farming, is saying, and start shutting down ideas, opportunities, patterns of thinking that would lead to anything other than farming, right?
Hmm.
So I think it's kind of both and, where you got to have adults that are willing to set up a broad range of experiences, even things that maybe you don't necessarily understand, like, or value, so that the young person can experience those things for themselves and freely experience them, right? Not experience them in a way like, oh my gosh, I'm going to do this, and um, mom and dad aren't going to like it if they find out. And that's a
Yeah.
dicey scenario to be involved in.
Yeah, and I think that's probably even as adults where we kind of buck up against the core values. I had this preconceived idea that the core values evolve and change, but they might just be, to your point, something that wasn't fleshed out early on and crystallizes as we get older. Would you
Right.
say that that's accurate?
Yeah, I mean that's the camp that I'm going to kind of operate out of, in terms of what core values are, and where do they come from, and how do you discover them. I'm of the camp of going back to my point of, there's only one you, there's only one Pete Beskus, right? And so I think that there's a reason and purpose that you're on this earth, uh, and part of figuring out who you are is to answer that question: why am I here? What am I supposed to be doing? What is my impact? And I think core values are attached to that.
Yeah, excellent. And I know you brought it up earlier, but let's go back to the importance of working with somebody to be able to flesh it out. Now, I mentioned it earlier that you and I worked together, and I thought I knew mine very well, but after having a conversation where you peeled that back a little bit and asked a few more questions that I didn't dig deep enough on, we were able to really narrow down, for me, four core values. So explain to me how you do it with other people, and maybe give a little insight to those listening.
Right. So I think that it's there's a lot of things wrapped up into that experience that you had with me. One is it's the power of doing something with somebody who has expertise or knowledge in the repetitions, right? And which I have, starting with kind of my origin of core values that I shared with you, but I'll quickly share it here for the folks that are tapping into this resource. Is I came across as a young person to the concept of core values as it was related to helping young people leave the gang lifestyle or the gang mentality, right? So for me, it was literally it was taught and trained to me as a matter of life and death, saying, hey, that if these young people don't who are gang affected, if they don't understand that at some point in time, if not already, the gang is going to ask them to do things that are perpendicular or not aligned with their own core values as an individual. If they aren't aware of that concept, then they won't recognize it when it comes, and then that's when they do, increasingly egregious things, right? Including, taking the lives of somebody else. And so for me, I was introduced to the concept, for better or worse, as it being a matter of life and death. Now, I still believe that to a certain degree, meaning that if you lived your whole life, uh, talking to the non-gang, affected type person, if you lived your whole life and you couldn't answer who am I, and what was my purpose and mission here, well, that's kind of living a life of death, right? I mean,
Yeah. Yeah,
so
you're really not going to be satisfied or
right,
always be unhappy, right?
right.
Like I feel that.
So I think part of what happened there is, again, it's not that difficult. There's a handful of exercises out there that anybody can access. You could Google it, core values exercise. There's even a whole coaching platform that's all centered on core values, right? So that part isn't difficult. The info is out there, right? And you can put yourself through a core values exercise, which typically looks like reading through a list of words picking words that for some reason stand out to you and saying that these are my core values. That's in it. I mean, that's grossly reduced, but in a nutshell, that's how that works, right? Um, Versus, okay, so just think about that though, right? If you're doing that example that I said, you're gonna print out or get access to some kind of text based. Here's a list of core value words, and you're gonna read them, and then you're gonna select them. Well, you're only tapping into core values through one sense, right? Either the reading and maybe if you sound them out aloud, maybe you kind of have that internal auditory sense. Uh, that's just not how a rounded experience with anything really comes about, right? Imagine, I mean, you're not a carpenter just because you read about how a nail and hammer works. You really figure out how to be a carpenter when you get
Un-
out. Start
Unless
banging.
you're putting together IKEA, and
Right.
then
And you never know what a carpenter
they
is.
were all, they were all experts.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's that working with somebody else that has what you want. In this case, I've worked with lots of people around helping them really crystallize what their core values are, and that's always going to be a more enriching experience around it. So, my take on core values. Okay, great. Pete, you've outlined your core values. You can even recite them to me. Okay, prove it. Right. That's always it's kind of like one layer.
Yeah.
Prove to me by where you spend your time, how you spend your money. Those are usually the two major things. How do you spend your time and how do you spend your money? Prove it to me that you know what your core values are, because they are evidenced by where you're spending your time and why you're spending your time, and where you're spending your money and why are you spending your money. And if you aren't making values based determinations for your time and money, then your core values aren't active there, or at least they're not intentionally active there. So
Yeah,
that's
and you're definitely not aligned with
right.
the. You won't feel good about those choices that you're making.
Right.
Yeah, no, that was really awesome description there. Since this is a podcast about tools and actionable tools for people listening, what's one tool or one piece of advice you'd give to somebody that they can implement right now, based off what we're talking about?
Well, I'm going to come back to is if this concept of core values isn't familiar to you, um, I would say square one. Find a core values exercise and put yourself through it. You can Google the one that I use most often because it's a little more tactile. Is the You can Google motivational interviewing core values card sort. Literally Google that. It'll take you to a PDF. That whole thing was developed with federal tax dollars, so it's yours to use and however you want. So don't feel bad about it. Um, it'll have the words that you'll cut up in little strips of paper, and then you'll put them in piles. Uh, Very important, important, not important. And then I have people sort through that exercise until they get about 3 to 5 core values in the very important stack. And so that's, we kind of have to hold yourself accountable to getting that stack down to 3 to 5. And as you know, part of the way that I work with people with core values, if you're going to use them to inform how you spend your time and how you spend your money, well, you got to have it down to like 3 or 5. If you have
Yeah.
it to 10, 15, or 20, it's just too diffuse. You're not going to be able to use it in a meaningful way on an everyday basis. So I would say get yourself in front of a core values exercise and put yourself through it. Step one. Step two, get with somebody who understands core values and understands how to really apply them to a life, and spend some time with them and go through that kind of hot seat experience, refining through the fire, so to speak, around core values, and prove it to them, prove it to themselves, to yourself, and prove it to them.
Yeah, you make it sound like it was a hot seat, but to be honest, it's a fun experience and it's a fun exercise. I think be able to talk that out with somebody who's just neutral is
Right.
really beneficial. It's not like you're talking to your friend or you're talking to a parent or somebody else. I had a really enjoyable time. It wasn't a fire seat
Great. Yeah,
at
yeah.
all. So what's one thing we didn't address that you think is critically important to share, or just something that would add some extra depth to this conversation?
Yeah, and I think that what I'll do there is kind of go a little bit deeper in my stance about, do core values evolve over time versus are they kind of always there? And just for context and reference, I'll pull or I'll just cite that. I ascribe to acorn theory that comes from James Hillman, who's a American psychologist, wrote several books. Um, the 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 code character or the force of character, I can't remember. Um, where a lot of my thoughts kind of come from this. But it's the idea that you're born with this acorn. That acorn could and should grow into a massive tree that has impact and recognition in your environments. But you have to have the right environment for that acorn to truly blossom and grow into the tree that it was meant to be. So that's the metaphor there. So that's the reason why I believe that you're brought into this world with core values. Hopefully, you're brought into a family or a context, a caregiver context where they also believe that and have helped you shape and nurture that into you. But if you're not, then you kind of go through life and you start taking on other people's values and then you come across the core values exercise. Well, again, I don't think that you're trying them out as much as you're discovering what was there in the first place, right? Kind of like Michelangelo and David, if I have that right. David was always in there. It was just my job to chip away the marble until he was fully visible and present. So that's really my take on it, and that's where working with somebody to say, okay, this is a core value that you're telling me that you have in your life. Why is it there? Where does it come from, right? And it's really, for me, it's getting them to anchor it back into some sort of life experience versus saying, well, that's what my dad always said, or that's what my mom always said, or that's what my job expects of me. Okay? So there's a difference between core values and then the execution of core values, like the behaviors,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I think that's where you and I had the breakthrough, where sometimes you can confuse the execution of core values as the core value itself. And so I do believe that the execution of core values will necessarily change over time. Like, for example, if I believe that um, sports is a way to reach and connect with other people, well, early in my life, I'm going to do that by being active in sports myself, right? But as I get older, I'm going to have to change that because I'm not going to be physically able to do what I used to be able to do 20, 30 years ago. I'm in that phase now. I'm mid 40s. I used to be pretty active, on the basketball court multiple days a week, and then it turned into coaching. Well, I would have to stagger that now, right? I wouldn't be able to play 5 or 6 days in a row of basketball because it's just I can't keep up with that anymore, or at least I'm choosing not to because of the potential injury or sacrifice it would make, right? So the execution of connecting to people through sports is going to look different over time, right? But probably that if you were to steal me back to that, I would say that connectedness to other people is a core value.
That's great. And I'm really glad that you dove into that and really fleshed it out because I think that's probably one of the key takeaways for people who are doing a core values exercise. One additional question to ask is how does it show up? Like, prove it. I think you said that earlier, prove it to me.
Right.
And I think that even if you're doing it for yourself for the first time, it's a very, very, very valuable way to stress test them.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So
So,
the prove it is, and I don't know if that was a question or not, but I'll quickly say to it is, again, this is like core values, and the implementation of core values is like any skill that you might learn, right? So at first it's going to be robotic. It might be difficult. It's not going to feel comfortable, but you'll get better and better at it over time. And so the prove it comes from, yeah, before I bought this car, yeah, before I signed up for this thing, yeah, before I said no to this, before I sent this email, before I wrote this agenda, I thought to myself, how am I going to bring my core values out in this opportunity, in this exchange, in this communication, right? So that's where the prove it comes from. People could say, yeah, absolutely, centered myself in my core values before I got on the phone, before I sent the email, before I sent the text, right? That's the prove it, in the later stages of refining core values.
yeah, and I think that's a really good, like I said, that's a great point to bring up as people explore it and for themselves over time. I really wanted to also give you an opportunity if somebody wants to work on their core values and they want to have an expert such as yourself, to bounce it apart. Where can they find you?
Yeah, absolutely. It's not up, but it'd be easy for me to put it up right away. I would just head over to my website, nicksotelo.com. and then do / core values. And what will happen there is I'll have a calendar that you can sign up on, and I'll give you about 30 minutes of my time, and you got to come to it with some core values exercise done already, and then we'll go through the prove it process.
Well, that's great because I have a core values exercise on my website as
Okay.
well. They can grab them from there and they can come chat with you. And like I said, I hope that they get the same, insight as I got for going through it. And I think you're a phenomenal resource. And everyone who's listening, reach out to Dr. Nick if you guys are having thoughts about trying to flesh out your core values. Nick, again, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. This was a fantastic talk.
Yeah. Thanks for having me, Pete. I really enjoyed it.
All right, see you.